Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all colleagues joining us today. Thank you for joining this Science Policy Updates for All It is a series of webinars, and this one is about From Crisis to Resilience, Farmer-Led Innovation, and Government Readiness to Prevent Future Food Crises. So today we will discuss how food systems can respond to the current input and fertilizer-related shock. Food systems are increasingly destabilized by climate, economics, and conflict shocks that interact and reinforce one another. So the 2026 conflict in the Middle East and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz have disrupted the fossil fuel, fertilizer, and feedstock flows on which input-intensive agriculture depends, constraining fertilizer and inputs availability. The aim of today's webinars is to look at both the immediate response and the longer-term resilience question. We will ask what farmers and other food systems actors can do now, and what governments and national food system processes can do to reduce exposure and vulnerability to future shocks. We will first have a presentation by Professor Thomas Cherico-Wenger, followed by a moderated panel with Dr. Shakuntala Hark-Singh-Sistalt, Dr. Mohamed Aid Kadi, and Professor Shenggen Fan, and then questions and answer. For the questions and answer, participants are invited to submit their questions through the Q&A function throughout the webinar. We will collect questions and bring them into the discussion during the final segment. To set the scene, I am pleased to invite Professor Thomas Cherico-Wenger from Agroscope in Switzerland and the Academy of Global Food Economics and Policy at China Agricultural University. Thomas will present the evidence and main arguments behind the webinar framing, including the role of farmer-led innovation, diversified systems, and public and private support in reducing long-term dependence on synthetic inputs. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can see my screen now. Very good. Well, hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's my pleasure to give this presentation here today, which is in parts also based on a publication that we have been preparing with the team that is present here for this presentation, for this webinar. I'd also like to thank the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub for the organization of this webinar, of course. So we'll be talking about farmer-led innovations and agricultural diversification as means to mitigate future food system crises. So I want to start talking about turning air into bread, which is a quote from a book by Hager in 2008, talking about the history of fertilizers. Fertilizers are a very critical and key part of this whole discussion because they feed billions of people and they are used and oftentimes also overused. They were developed by two scientists, Haber and Bosch, in the earliest 20th century. And essentially here, air and hydrogen from natural liquefied gas is turned into ammonia that is now used as inorganic fertilizer. Fertilizers, they're not used equally across the world. We have deficits in African countries. They import a lot of fertilizers, and we have overuse in countries in Asia. The largest consumer is China. But we also have the trend that, as you see here on this figure on the right, we have increasing fertilizer use. But at the same time, at the bottom here, you see that basically an increasingly nitrogen efficiency when we look at cereal crops. So basically half of the nitrogen that we are applying to our fields is not actually reaching the crops. Now let's jump to a crisis that I think we're all very much aware of, the Iran war and the consequences. And I want to start with mentioning the thousands of lives lost, mostly in Iran and also in Lebanon, as the key consequence, of course, of this tragic war. But also related to our discussion here is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz that Jean-François already pointed out in the beginning. The consequence is so dramatic because 1/4 of the globally traded crude oil is going through the Strait of Hormuz. 1/3 of global fertilizer exports, and as well almost 1/4 of the liquefied natural gas is going through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, closing this means that we have lower fuel and fertilizer availability, and costs of these commodities will increase. And overall, this will lead to increasing food prices. These crises, unfortunately, do not come as single events. In fact, the next one related to climate is felt very much, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. So we have high fertilizer and fuel use costs that do affect the planting decisions, and it has already affected the harvests in the 2026 season. So we have seen reports from southern France, for example, where harvested were diminished in many other parts of the world. And this is projected to continue until 2027. On top of that, however, we're seeing heat waves all across the Northern Hemisphere and extreme weather events that will be topped off by an El Nino event that is predicted to be much stronger than any other recorded before. So we have this additional effect. And the predictions are that approximately 45 million people could potentially face hunger in the coming years. And the most vulnerable in this whole food system crisis are those that are in low-income countries and depending on these inputs. Now, when we look at the current policy discussion, it is mainly centered around fertilizer supply solutions. So how can we make sure that we have sufficient fertilizer supplies in the near future to mitigate these crises? And that's, for once, through buffer stock. So we have strategic reserves that whenever we have a shock, they can be released. Through green ammonia production. So we produce our ammonium more or less independent of the liquefied natural gas close to the sites of where the farms are. And then we breed for crops that are more efficient to use nitrogen, so enhancing nitrogen use efficiency. And all of that treats fertilizer as a strategic infrastructure to secure the supply. But what it doesn't do is actually get rid of this enormous dependence of food systems on fertilizers. And this is what I would like to talk about a bit more now. So the missing aspect of this discussion is basically focusing from the supply to the demand, to the farmer side, and the initiatives that farmers can lead to reduce fertilizers, and that can help us not just to overcome crises related to fertilizers, but also enhance overall food system resilience, which is, of course, in the face of climate change, a core topic. One of the key postulated solutions here are diversified systems. And they have overall been shown they work pretty well. And I would just want to give you an example from smallholder rice farming in China. So the picture that you see here is Mangu rice farming. It's traditional rice varieties that are located within forests, within trees. So we have an agroforestry system here. And these systems are known to be very biodiversity friendly and also facilitating the value of the local communities and the diversity of local communities and the equality in local communities. Now, this is a classical smallholder example of long-term traditional diversified systems. The question is, if we want to scale this up, how do we get to large-scale maize production, for example? If we have a monoculture here that uses a certain amount of fertilizers, what we can do is we can implement a diversification over time. We can implement a maize-soy rotation, for instance. That is not done everywhere where maize is produced, unfortunately. What we can also do, and you see this here on the right side of that figure, you can introduce these prairie strips, and these plants have very deep roots. And because of that, you can avoid nitrogen loss from the soils through these diversification strategies. And the evidence suggests that basically these diversification strategies, they also work not just in these smallholder systems, but also in large-scale farming systems. So there's a real opportunity here. I want to present you now some of the higher level scientific evidence, and in the panel discussion, you will hear more of the interesting case studies on that. So one of the large-scale synthesis studies focuses on crop rotation. So that's based on over 3,500 field observations. And on this figure here on the right, you see at the x-axis, you can see different rotation types. On the y-axis, you see revenue and nutrients and the energy that comes out of these rotations. And yellow dots mean positive effects, or red dots mean negative, and gray mean neutral effects. And we can see that we found overall that up to 1/4 of the effects on yield, energy, nutrient are positive. But related to this nutrient discussion, we see that rotation benefits has actually a declining effect on all these benefits the more nitrogen fertilization we apply. And moreover, in rotations with legumes, the fertilizer input could almost be reduced by half compared to monocultures. So that's a high-level general picture of some of the benefits of crop rotations. We can now also synthesize all the evidence that is available and look at long-term benefits of agricultural diversification. So what we did here is we synthesized almost 200,000 individuals' comparisons and 120 years of data for different outcomes. So you see financial profitability, for instance, here you see carbon sequestration, water regulation, and soil fertility. And overall, and again, this is the aggregated high-level picture, you see that compared to just snapshot studies, that the benefits of diversification over a long time period increase by 189%. And the most important and most promising factors here are actually crop diversification. So these are practices such as agroforestry. You include Gliricidia trees in cocoa plantations, and you have nitrogen fixation in these agroforestry systems. We talked about crop rotation just now, but also you can achieve something like this when you plant different cultivars in your field. So that's also arguing for diversity of seeds, diversity of crops in crop production. So again, this is a very high-level statement. Science really shows that diversification overall, it does work. But now you can ask, so why is that not very broadly implemented? And there is a couple of barriers, and I'm just naming two very important ones here. So one is the upfront cost. When you change your production system from something that is more simple to something that is more diverse, you have operational costs. You need to adjust your machinery potentially, but you also have risks that you need to mitigate. And then when we look at trade, usually trading partners, they want cheap bulk commodities. They're not interested in diverse, different crops, different mixed commodities. And so here we're arguing that the crisis really changes, or a crisis really changes the perception of cost and risk. And we see this from farmers already, when they say, well, currently we don't have inputs to apply and we're losing yields due to heat waves. The motivation is very different to implement a strategy that facilitates resilient food systems, even though the upfront costs and the risk might be high in the beginning. So there are a couple of solutions, and I'm not going to go into all the details here, but they have been pointed out in many high-level outlets recently. So for lower fertilizer dependence and climate adaptation, rotations with legumes are very useful. Agroforestry systems are widely discussed. Crop varieties that are diverse, that have different higher nitrogen use efficiency, very important. We can also implement more biofertilizers and precision agriculture that makes nitrogen application more efficient. I want to talk more about the enabling factors for farmer-led initiatives. Basically, we have three aspects here to cover, I think. One is long-term funding for food system resilience. And I want to walk you through this graph here on the right, which is a little bit complicated. I'm sorry for that. So we have on the x-axis the time since a shock. The first shock would be, for instance, the Iran war here. The second would be any subsequent shock. And on the y-axis, we have food system resilience. Now, if farmers implement diversification practices or any innovation strategy, we are on the green curve. And after some time, there will be the crisis is over. So this overcoming costs and higher risk part will actually fade. Now it's important to think about funding for a continuous trajectory here that also helps increasing resilience for future shocks. Funding is critical. If we don't have that, and then we're on the red curve here, it will actually drop and potentially go even back to pre-crisis levels. So how can we achieve this? There are many different directions, but we were thinking of redirecting subsidies just from fertilizer use to risk mitigation, about public-private partnerships where different partners actually come together with the same motivation to then pilot funding and projects from a pilot all the way to scaling up. And then for these long-term funding opportunities, involving farmers in the design of these funding opportunities is critical to fund the right innovations. The second trajectory to enable farmer-led initiatives is emerging technologies and to enhance the readiness for impact. And I think there's also three important points. The first is the integration of high-tech farming and diversified systems. So how can these two come best together, and how can we combine, for instance, phenotyping and harvesting robots with rotation systems? Do we have to make large adjustment, or is this just something that can be done very easily? Monitoring through low-cost sensors, embedded systems to optimize these inputs from nitrogen-based fertilizers, but also decision support tools that enables farmers access to information on diversification practices. And for all of this, it is critical to involve farmers in the what, where, and hows, so that we're actually not going left or right when we actually have to go straight. And the third and last point would be policies for private and public action to then scale up these farmer-led initiatives. The first point would be leveraging the UN Food System Summit national pathways that are implemented in different countries, and see how this can be coupled to funded national investment plans, well knowing that this is a very ambitious goal. The second could be to shift towards integrated policy frameworks. So basically from siloed departments, ministries, into something that is more mission-oriented, a goal, and then the different actors come together, for instance, toward climate resilient smallholder systems. And the last point would be innovation governance, and policy labs. So here, this is also linked a bit to technology, to create a space to test policies and use that as a decision support tool to see how the different actors that respond to those policies and what could be a suitable way forward. I want to close with an outlook on resilient food systems. I think a critical point here is to create the enabling conditions overall for farmer-led initiatives, but also for the supply of input security. So first, the crisis that we're seeing here, but in fact, any crisis can be the time for solution implementation. And it is critical to note that we're not saying that securing this input supply is not important. It is actually very critical in the systems that we currently have. But on top of that, I think it's critical that we also have this transforming lens towards low input and climate adaptive food systems. And lastly, the funding, the timing of when the funding comes and the availability of funding is absolutely key. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to your question. And if you're interested, if you scan the QR code, this is the link to the preprint that kind of summarizes what I talked about in this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this clear presentation and for helping us to connect the immediate crisis with the longer-term resilience agenda. We will now move to the second part of this webinar, to the panel discussion, and I will ask two guiding questions which were shared with the panelists in advance. For each question, I will invite each panelist to respond in around 3 minutes so that we can hear all perspectives and still leave time for questions. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Shakuntala Haraksingh-Sistel, former director of the Nutrition, Health and Food Security Impact Area Platform at CGIAR and Scientific Advisory Committee Chair. Also Dr. Mohamed Aid Kadi, resident member of the Hassan II Academy of Sciences and Technology of Morocco and chair of the Scientific Committee of the Adaptation of African Agriculture Initiative. He is also a member of our Scientific Advisory Board. And Professor Shenggen Fan, Dean of the Academy of Global Food Economics and Policy at China Agricultural University, and former Director General of IFPRI and SAC co-chair. So let me start with the first questions. How can farmers and other actors in the food system respond in the short term to limit the negative impacts, noting their exposure to other shocks such as heat waves, droughts, and floods? And what are the success stories? So I would like to start with you, Shakuntala. In your view, what can farmers and other actors do in the short term, particularly where food security and nutrition are already under pressure? Thank you. To you, Shakuntala.
Thank you so much, Jean-Francois. And let me begin with some of the work that we have been doing in the Scientific Advisory Committee and the support that we have been giving to other groups. At the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021, which had an overall agenda to transform food systems to nourish all people and the planet, 3 groups of people, women, youth, including, of course, young people, and indigenous young women, and indigenous peoples were brought into focus. And now I wish to make some remarks on the role of women in food systems and how their practices and use of knowledge are vital for securing food security and nutrition for all. We do know that women in rural communities are heavily engaged in all nodes of food systems, and especially in home gardens, with production of diverse nutrient crops, including, for example, in Africa, sorghum, which requires less water and nutrient inputs than maize. Diverse vegetables are integral to women's gardens, producing seasonally with high contents of micronutrients for nourishing their families and also for sale. Women can benefit from adopting suitable technologies, for example, using a small planter for sorghum, drip irrigation, and the use of garden and kitchen waste for improving soil nutrient and soil structure. In populations near to water bodies, we have also seen a greater reliance on aquatic foods, especially small fish species which are caught in the wet season, dried, and kept for use in the dry season. Assisting women to use suitable solar drying facilities and airtight storage containers can retain nutrients and reduce loss. Importantly, diversity in food produce and providing suitable technologies and practices for women in different nodes of the food systems are vital to abate the negative consequences of shock, as we have heard today about the lack of or the increase in the price of fertilizers. Therefore, supporting and financing women community organizations are vital for both imparting knowledge, but also giving training so women can get the best benefits of their work and their time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shakuntala. Mohamed, may I turn to you, especially with your experience on agricultural adaptation and African food systems? What short-term responses have you seen that can help farmers manage input shocks while also dealing with droughts, floods, and climate stress? To you, Mohamed.
Thank you, Jean-François. It is a privilege to contribute to this exchange on a question that, in my view, engages both our science and our conscience. How to move our food systems from crisis response to genuine resilience. I would like to share 4 convictions drawn from the Moroccan experience that speak directly to this. The first conviction is that resilience is built over time, not decreed in crisis. Food security can no longer be reduced to production alone. It must be understood systemically. Production, access, especially for the most vulnerable household, and nutritional and sanitary quality. Morocco's experience illustrates this shift from strict self-sufficiency in the 70s to a strategic self-supplied approach that is a solid domestic production base combined with the capacity to import under the best economic conditions, guided by comparative advantage. What was the result? The result was that coverage rates are among the highest in the MENA region, around 53% for cereals, which are rainfall dependent, 44% for sugar, and close to 100% for fruits, vegetables, meat, and milk. My second conviction is that farmers are already innovating. Policy must meet them where they are. Farmer-led innovation is often invisible because it is incremental. You have crop diversification, as we heard. We have water service saving practices, conservation agriculture, adapting variety to shorter rainfall windows, fertilizers, as we heard. So the role of government is to de-risk and scale what farmers already do. I would like also to say that science must connect with the field. Morocco's agricultural research and development and innovation 2030 roadmap targets new production techniques, food conservation, genomic tools, and artificial intelligence. But as we can agree, a roadmap only matters through implementation, investment, and skilled people. My third conviction is that the cheapest production gains are the ones we stop losing. Post-harvest losses are a neglected reserve of production. We did a study here in Morocco on soft wheat, and we found losses of about 20% at commercial sale, at production stage, 5 to 7% in storage, and 5% at commercial sale. So cutting these losses could raise available production by 10 to 15%, with no new land and no additional water. I would like also to mention that local processing builds shocks absorbers. Morocco's agri-food processing rate is around 20% today, with a target of 70% by 2030. If I give you the dairy example, we have 82 industrial units, 2,700 collection centers, and over 60% of production processed industrially. Let me also add, diversification is a resilience requirement. And I think we have heard this in the previous presentation. My fourth conviction is that climate is the stress test of readiness. Morocco faces recurrent droughts, rising temperatures, and declining rainfall, hitting grain-fed cereal farming hardest. Mitigation measures and strategic imports operate as complementary buffers. So the answer, in my view, is an eco-efficient agriculture. Water mastery through drip irrigation, conservation agriculture against soil degradation, revegetation of rangelands against desertification. Readiness also means addressing the nutrition transition, and we heard Shukantala talking about this. Obesity and diet-related disease alongside persistent deficiencies. Rural-urban disparities in access to nutritious food. So this is to say that resilience has also a social dimension. Shukantala talked about women and young people, but this social dimension should go along the technological and economical dimensions. So let me close by saying that if I had to summarize my message in one word, it would be cooperation. We need cooperation. No country will succeed in these transitions alone. African nations in particular should build win-win regional partnerships, concrete co-development projects, shared promotion of our quality products, and joint advocacy in multilateral fora to correct the distortion that still weigh on global agricultural trade and also on lack of finance for adaptation. So, colleagues and friends, let's make food security not a constraint we endure, but an ambition we share with farmers as co-authors of the solution and governments as enablers of their innovation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohamed, for this integrated perspective on resilience, especially with African food system. Schengen, may I invite you to respond to the same question? What can be done by farmers, markets, and policymakers to reduce the immediate negative impacts of this type of shock? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think Tom has already given a very good presentation, particularly using China as a case. So I will speak on China, probably and beyond. Okay, the farmers responded immediately by diversifying their crops, let's say from wheat, rice, maize, to vegetables, to beans. I have seen that in China. I have seen that in Africa. For example, if a major drought comes, the first crop may not be able to grow anything. Then the farmers will wait until rain comes, or wait on other crops that do not require much rain, like beans, vegetables, and so on. So that's the diversification beyond stable crops. That's number one. Number two is diversification of income. Mohammed mentioned about it, resilience. for not just for individual, not just the households, not just community, not just let's say the economy. It's a whole society. It's a whole society. So that's why diversify income to non-agriculture activities, to migration, will be another response here in China as well as in other countries. Now, within agriculture, I think there's another dimension, that is the use of organic fertilizers. So the chemical fertilizer price has gone up, but there are lots of let's say biomass that can be used as organic fertilizer. You know, China has a tradition of recycle animal, even human waste back to the soil. We have been doing that for thousands years. I think we are asked about the farmers' innovation. Well, this is not necessarily new innovation, but definitely it's very practical to use organic fertilizer to replace chemical fertilizers. As you know, when you use organic fertilizer, you build the soil nutrients, you increase the organic matters in soil. So that actually increases the resilience of soil. So if this next drought comes, the soil can still provide good nutrients for crops. So I think the organic fertilizer is another very critical instrument in dealing with crisis. Now, these are farmers. Now, what the government is doing? Firstly, actually, to your surprise, China actually also has fertilizer stock in addition to grain stock. So government actually released fertilizer stock to the market. So that's why the fertilizer price has not risen as not as high as global markets. So that's one. And now China actually is planning to release some of their stocks to global market starting September. So that will help to calm down the global fertilizer price. So in addition to grains, some of the inputs, key inputs, can be stored for the use during crisis. So that's another important role the government should play. I think Mohammed mentioned about the role of the government. Now, obviously, social protection. If the farmers suffer, if the consumers suffer from higher prices, then social protection, direct income transfer, all the social protection linked to food consumption have to be launched. So in this case, consumers or everybody's nutrition security will not be compromised. I mean, particularly for children and women. Now, for children, if they suffer from lack of nutritious foods, even for a week, then their growth will be compromised. Their mental, their physical, the income generation capacity will be, let's say, reduced over their lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Schengen. And I think you have addressed, all of you, the role of farmers and food systems actors, but you started discussing a bit what can be done with national preparedness and the role of food systems pathways. So my second question is precisely about this. How could national food systems improve their resilience to such shocks? Is there a role of national food systems transformation pathways? How could these pathways be improved? And how can the UNFSS, UN Food Systems Summit process support the response to this crisis? Shakuntala, may I come back to you first about this perspective? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean-Francois. And let me say to all who are listening, please do go to the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub and look for the national pathways and of your countries and of all other countries and see how and it would be really nice to look at how they compare with each other and what they can do together. So integral to the national pathway for nutritious and sustainable food systems are the very many people from different spheres who are engaged at the different nodes. They belong to different groups, for example, policymakers, farmers, and they belong to different sectors, for example, food, health, education. However, at the country level, the national pathway is powerful to bring these different groups of people and bring these different sectors together. We must not only respond to shocks, as we are discussing today, but we must build and implement pathways that meet the needs of all people in the nation under all circumstances and at all times. We started this process with the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021, and we have strengthened the process with the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub and with the Scientific Advisory Committee members who report to them. We have identified that the inclusion of women, of youth, and indigenous peoples are crucial for success. Going forward, countries, governments, and their partners must prioritize finances and staff to work together to implement the national pathway. At the regional level, countries must also work together, support each other, and importantly, learn from the successes of each other. As we heard from Mohammed, we are looking for cooperation, the importance of cooperation. So when we gather again in 2027, let us look forward to celebrating the successes that we have had. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shakuntala, and thank you for reminding us the role of the UN Food System Summit and the national pathways. So now I turn to you, Mohammed. How do you see this question on government readiness? Thank you.
Yes, as I mentioned, the role of the government is very important. Government should be the enablers of what farmers undertake. This is very important. So it raises, of course, the question, how do you finance farmer-led innovation? In Morocco, we used a territorialized approach, not a one-size-fits-all plan. Blended public-private investment in processing and in irrigation, and important to all of these are what we call the de-risking instruments: insurance, guaranteed collection networks, such as for dairy, as I mentioned in my presentation. One question also that comes often is about the population growth. Morocco's demographic growth fell from 2.6% in 1982, 1994 to about 0.96%, less than 1%. So today, combined with productivity gains, per capita food availability has substantially improved. So the real question that we are facing now is producing better, not just more.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. May I turn to you, Schengen, for the same questions? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the systems approach is a must. We cannot afford to work in silos. We used to work just to produce more rice, more grains, or somehow we use some health methods to fix the malnutrition problem using a health perspective, or then we try to protect the environment later on. I think this is not good enough. We must bring all this together: health, nutrition, environment, climate change, food and nutrition security in a system. So food system includes all this. Now, so what is the role of the government? The government needs to invest in infrastructure, irrigation, rural roads, and so on to provide an enabling environment for all the actors work together. So investment infrastructure, in particular here, the R&D investment is also critical. But R&D investment is not just for producing more rice, more wheat. Equally important is to produce nutritious, healthy foods. Equally important is to address some of the climate change issues, climate adaptation, mitigation, and so on. So R&D has a big role to play, and that has to come from the government. Now, I think the consumers also have a big role to play. Consumers, I think globally you'll see that consumers are becoming more overweight, obese. That has led a lot of non-communicable disease problems. So can we help to work with consumers to make sure that what they eat really, let's say, sustainable for the environment? Of course, healthy and nutritious for their own health. So I think the consumers plays a very big role too. Now, the private sector, obviously, their final ambition is to make money. But how can we make sure that we can design certain government regulations or instruments, financing incentives, and NGOs pressure to make sure that the private sector can help deliver the outcomes of the food system transformation, such as nutrition, health, environment, climate change, and even resilience or inclusion. I do think every actor has a role to play. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Schengen. And thank you very much to all panelists. We have heard that immediate responses matter, but that they need to be connected to a longer-term shift in how food systems manage risks. So we have seen several points: the importance of supporting farmer-led innovation, the need to reduce exposure to input shocks, the value of diversified farming systems, and the role of national pathways, financing, de-risking, and science policy processes in turning crisis response into resilience. Before we open the Q&A, I would like to ask you, Thomas, for a brief reflection in response to the panel. Can you have this in just 1 minute? Thank you.
Oh, in just 1 minute. No, I think a lot of important points were covered. I liked the intervention, of course, from Shakuntala that we need to enable and facilitate women initiatives. That's a very important point. I strongly echo what Mohammed said in terms of we need to build these lasting partnerships and learn from the experience that farmers have. And I think Schengen made very important points that we can certainly not compromise on the nutrition aspect through more diversified systems for the different actors in the systems, because this will very much compromise how a population in general will look at in the future. I think the discussion of the panel really summarized the state quite well. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. So now we will open the floor for questions. So I invite participants to submit questions through the Q&A box. Please indicate if your question is addressed to a specific speaker, and we will try to group questions so that we can cover the main themes in the remaining time. Thank you. I think that so far we got a first question. If I'm correct with looking at Q&R, we got several questions. Okay, so let me try to group those questions so I can ask some of the panelists. So I think we have a first question about the role of legumes, the role of urea fertilizers, and I would be keen to ask this maybe directly to you, Thomas, because we know that such solutions can be technically very successful, but what then are the barriers to build resilience and to have more organic fertilizers? Maybe we can start by this one, which is more, let's say, question for agricultural practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the first question is about international benchmarking, and how this can be implemented. What comes to my mind, being based at the moment in Switzerland, is the, not technically EU, but still we're kind of are surrounded by the EU farm to fork strategy, which has very much binding strategies for reduced nutrient loss by 50% and fertilizer loss used by 20% by 2030. And we have pretty much a dedicated EU protein strategy that, to my understanding, is currently the most explicit government-led benchmark architecture that really links legumes to fertilizer reduction. That would be one of the benchmark studies. There are several others, or several benchmark. There's for the benchmarks, there's several others. And then in terms of maybe national case studies, one that comes to mind would be soy production in Brazil. So here we have, Embrapa's soybean production that builds on biological nitrogen fixation from the rhizobium inoculants, just rather than using the fertilizers. And that is actually a big economic benefit for soy production. So here we really have already inoculants substituting fertilizers. I think that's a critical part. And then maybe I can comment briefly also on the biofertilizer part that was mentioned here in the second question. So coming back to that part of soy production in Brazil, we do have commercial applications of biofertilizers based on rhizobium, for instance. So the science behind that is, to my understanding, it's not my core area of expertise. My understanding of this is that the science and the implementation of that is two different things. So we can actually use it, but the infrastructure surrounding that, to actually make it really scalable, this is where the next investment needs to come in. The cold chains, to actually the distribution of these inoculants, these kind of things. I mean, how can existing structures be coupled with the new requirements for these biofertilizers? I think this is what I could say in this context.
Thank you. I'm wondering if other panelists want to complement these answers, or if we move to the next question, which is more about, let's say, the role of governments and policies. Is it okay? So we will move on. And we have two questions. One is about what are the implementation tools or governance mechanisms which have been most successful during crisis? So this is clearly an important question. And the same type of question, what needs to be done now so that farmer-led innovations can move from isolated successes to nationally fundable, risk-verified systems? So I think those two questions are quite complementary. And maybe I will start with you, Schengen, about those questions.
Sure, yes. I think now globally, we are spending more than $700 billion in production subsidies, subsidizing fertilizers, pesticides, and output price purchase, or sometimes the free water, free electricity. All these subsidies are not sustainable. They do not produce healthy, nutritious foods. They also do not benefit smallholders. So how can we make sure that the government subsidy policy can help to address some of the issues we have just discussed? So for example, Thomas mentioned about the beans, legumes. I think, in the future, we should not just support stable crops, maize, wheat, rice. What about the beans? Because beans have certain positive externalities, good for the environment, good for soil, good to nutrition for everybody. So market cannot deliver all this value. So I think the government should help to correct that market failure. So by providing more support to nutritious, healthy foods. That's one. Then on organic fertilizers, again, can government help research organizations to develop some high quality, less bulky organic fertilizer that can be easily used by farmers? So I think government policies have a big role to play. It's not just all to subsidize more urea production through price or through imports. I don't think that's the right solution. The right solution is to help farmers to use more organic fertilizers, to use fertilizers more efficiently. For example, mix the water irrigation water and fertilizer together, using solar irrigation. So there are lots of technology that can do it. But the question is why farmers are not using it? Because they don't know, because there's no financial incentive for them to do that. So I think here the government support policy must be repurposed, reprioritized to support all these nutritious, healthy, sustainable food production systems. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Shengen. Maybe to you, Shakuntala, because we have an experience, I think, about such a crisis for nutrition and food security and the role of securing healthy food systems. So how do you look into these combined shocks right now? What would be most urgent to do?
I do agree that, as Shengen says, that governments have a vital role to play. And already we can see by some of the actions they take, and I would like to reinforce what Shengen said about the actions of governments on their use of finances for subsidies. That is one that can be easily reformed and used to support good practices and to support small scale farmers and also women in agriculture. There is so much that can be done, and perhaps governments need support to understand how they can reframe subsidies into other packages that can have a better effect on food systems, on meeting food security and nutrition of their population. And importantly, what it means for the country in terms of economics, in terms of development, in terms of the health and wealth of their populations, in terms of young children. I do think that there is space for helping governments to better understand these needs and then to reprioritize. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shakuntala, because we see the need for these integrated policies covering also health and nutrition. And Mohammed, how do you see these responses we can have? What would be the top priorities? You explained very well and with a very integrated perspective what is done in Morocco. But do you think that something more needs to be done because we have now such large shocks, both in terms of climate change and of these input limitations? Oh, sorry, you are muted, Mohammed.
Yeah, I think the answer is not easy because food security can no longer be reduced to production alone. As I said, it must be understood systematically. We need to look to the whole path, production, access, especially for the most vulnerable household. And you mentioned the issues of nutrition and sanitary quality. So this is a holistic approach. We cannot take things in a very disparate. We should also really I mentioned, especially for Africa, this issue of cooperation is very important. And we need to build bridges between our countries so that we can combat hunger and malnutrition. It's not an easy problem, but I was going to say it's a humanitarian problem. No, it's a political problem. We need to think about it seriously.
Thank you. So, dear colleagues, I'm afraid we will need to close up shortly. We were not able to answer all questions. I would like to note that we had questions about land use planning, that we had questions about the role of local governments, and that indeed those questions come together because we see, and this was well mentioned by Mohamed, for instance, that decisions cannot be taken only at the national scales. They need to be anchored in local realities and local farming systems. So we are well aware about this. And I think that we had also a question about international rules. And we here again, as mentioned by Shakuntala, we have a unique process which is led at the highest level by the United Nations, which is the United Nations Food Systems Summit. And this process is actually creating something unique, which is having national food systems pathways for their transformation. So we have already tools. We have noted by previous work of our board that the current national pathways are in some sense incomplete. They are not covering all aspects. We have noted that not all countries are able to have a whole of government approach, which would be needed to have integrated policies. And we have also noted that the role of evidence and science could be further improved by having some science society policy interfaces that could play a strong role, and by having certainly cooperation internationally, but also on a local scale. So I think we can leave you with those perspectives. And I would like to thank again all panelists. And maybe if we have 1 minute more, if you would like, dear panelists, to have a closing word, just 1 word or two. And I will start with you, Shakuntala.
Thank you so much, Jean-Francois. As we have heard from Thomas, we are experiencing shocks to food systems, and these have serious implications to ensure food security and nutrition, especially for poor and vulnerable. And I want to, if there's one point I want to make, is ensuring the active engagement and participation of women, including young women at all levels, in the solutions we undertake. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakuntala. To you, Mohamed?
Well, I think farmers are in the face of different kind of crises, are struggling, and they are already innovating, but policy must meet them where they are. That's my point.
Thank you, Mohamed. And to you, Schengen?
Schengen?
Oh, sorry, maybe we have a connection problem with Professor Schengen Fan. So, oh, Schengen, are you back?
No.
Okay, I think we have a connection problem here. So in any case, I would like to thank you, Thomas, Shakuntala, Mohamed, and Schengen for your thoughtful contributions. Thank you to all participants for joining us today. We have seen that this crisis is a warning about the vulnerability of food systems, and that we need innovation, we need enabling policies, financing, technology, advisory services, and institutions. And national food system transformation pathways can play an important role if they are used as practical instruments for preparedness, implementation, and coordination. So the UNFSS process can support this by helping countries connect evidence, policy, finance, and peer learning around resilience. Let me close by saying on behalf of the Scientific Advisory Committee and the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub, thank you again, and wishing you a good rest of the day. Bye.